Welcome. You are watching a Libertarian Party of Michigan special. I am Connor Nepomuceno, the Communications Director for the Libertarian Party of Michigan, and I am joined by Gregory Stempfle, the Libertarian Party of Michigan candidate for Secretary of State, and Mary Buzuma, our candidate for governor. Welcome, guys. How you guys doing today?
Good, thank you.
Good, thanks.
All right, so let's hop into this. So how many times have each of you guys ran for office? Greg?
This is the 13th time I've run for office. I ran for Secretary of State 4 years ago also.
And Mary?
This is my 5th run. I also ran for governor back in 2014. But I've also run for U.S. Congress, state representative, state senate, and county clerk, register of deeds of Ottawa County.
All right. Thank you, guys. So we're going to do something a little different. We aren't going to be talking about your campaigns for a little bit, but let's get to know each of you guys a little bit. So I want to know about your guys' story about how you got into libertarianism. Mary, why don't you tell us about that?
I had just retired in 2005. I had retired from the Navy, and I was stuck in traffic one day coming back from Norfolk. And I was listening to a radio show, and there was a gentleman on called Ron Paul. And as I was listening to him, I was starting to think, well, to go back, I was always a Democrat. I came to the Libertarian Party from the Democrats. So I was listening to Ron Paul, and a lot of what he was talking about made a lot of sense to me. Wow, this guy's pretty good. So I had to find out some more about him. So I went home and looked him up and bought his book, Liberty, a Manifesto. And the next weekend I had to donate some books to a book fair. Well, they had postponed it, but I didn't get the word anyway. But across the street there was a restaurant, and there was a banner in front of it saying for the Libertarian Party of Virginia, or the Tidewater Libertarian Party. So I thought I'd go over there and check it out, and before you know it, I became a member of the Libertarian Party.
Before we move to Greg, what was the one thing Ron Paul said that kind of just lit a fire under your ass?
Well, he was talking about the Federal Reserve, and that really intrigued me. But another thing, too, is he was talking about currencies and about competing currencies, and that also intrigued me quite a bit as far as, with our money, and I thought that was excellent.
Yeah. Wow. Imagine that currency is an important issue. Greg, why don't you tell us your story?
I first got into libertarianism my sophomore year in college when I went to Michigan State. This would have been 96, and so the internet was, a thing for the first time. It was the first time ever using a web browser. That year, I met Harry Brown, the Libertarian candidate for president. I also met a gentleman named Jerry White, the Socialist Party candidate for president. So there was a time I was, I wasn't sure. I sort of came from the left, but I kind of rejected both major parties. I was kind of dissatisfied with my college education at that point. It felt like just a review of high school. And so at that point, I was really starting to become disaffected with things. I had always had kind of a, not so much counterculture vibe, but I always looked for the underdog. When I was really into professional sports, my favorite sports were arena football and indoor lacrosse. When I was into music, I listened to industrial. So I've always kind of gone outside the mainstream. So when I was getting into politics, libertarianism and socialism were the two things I was looking at because I met them, and libertarianism just made more sense to me ultimately. And I became involved in the party at that point. I got involved in the Michigan State libertarian group up there. Interesting story. I ran for U.S. Congress maybe 20 years after that. And one of the candidates that ran against me was an independent candidate named Jerry White. So the socialist candidate for president ultimately ran against me for Congress years later, ended up beating him. So the time he spent with me trying to recruit me to his party was a little bit counterproductive for him. But it was great to be exposed to so much different political views at that age in my life. It really shaped my worldview moving on.
So you met Harry Brown.
I did. I met Harry Brown.
What did he say to you that was compelling?
I think the most compelling thing to me is he would always kind of cite examples. A lot of libertarians would just kind of talk abstractly, but he had a book and he talked about why government doesn't work, and he had a budget and everything. So it was a very clear-cut, laid-out plan for how he wanted to be as president. I traditionally was a little bit more left-wing, so I think the anti-drug war thing was one thing I had really, at that point, was kind of a big deal for me.
All right, so moving on, the country has changed dramatically over the last couple of years between COVID, the response to COVID, the 2020 election, the craziness of January 6th, and the turmoil that a collapsing economy is bringing to us. So would you tell us about your experiences over these last 2 years? Let's start with Greg.
Do you mean the COVID?
Yeah, your experience with COVID.
I had a really unique experience. First, I was a state party chair at the time, so I sort of had to deal with the fallout of that. But I also worked I work at Henry Ford Hospital in the clinical laboratory, and my supervisor, I work in the organ transplant lab, but the supervisor of my lab is also the infectious disease supervisor. So I had kind of more of a heads up knowing that COVID was kind of coming. We were developing tests and everything beforehand. And so I was a state party chair, and our first convention happened right when the COVID really hit the fan, and we ended up having to postpone our first convention. So for me, I wasn't quite as affected by the lockdowns because I worked in the clinical laboratory, but my biggest issue was, as the chair of the party, we kept having to replan conventions. I think we planned twice as many conventions as we actually had. So for me, my big thing was just, it was logistically very difficult to run the party during that time frame. And I still think we're kind of struggling. The restaurants are still not quite up to speed, but things are getting back to normal. But my year was, kind of interesting, working in the medical field and trying to run a political party at that time.
Mary, what was your experience?
Well, my experience was a little different. For the past, 3 years, even before the COVID hit, I was a caregiver to my mother, who was diagnosed with Alzheimer's dementia. And when the lockdowns occurred, when you're dealing with somebody with this disease, and by the way, it's just awful. Any sort of disruption to any type of routine is devastating. And what happened with the lockdowns just really zoomed her down, because we were pretty much isolated. Churches were closed. She couldn't see her friends. She couldn't. Anybody who came over had to have a mask on. She didn't like masks on people. She didn't like to wear them. But the biggest thing is because everything shut down. There were groups and organizations that would help take care of my mother, but unfortunately they were all closed. You could get some support online or with various groups, excuse me, but they were always at a time when I was busy with her. In the afternoons, I was busy with her, trying to, keep her distracted, trying to keep her from going out of the house and then in the evenings, I had to get to bed early because I went to bed when she did, because I knew I would be up all night taking care of her. So, and as the isolation progressed, so she degressed. So I had to watch that. And it's, like I said, it's really devastating if you've had to go through it personally. And I feel for everyone who had to deal with this. And when things finally let up or started to come back, I was able to get some help. But unfortunately, and was able to place her in a memory care, because I couldn't be living on 2 hours of sleep at night anymore. It was killing me. And but they were under different protocols too, because they had to work with the Department of Health Health and Human Services at the same time with OSHA, and the regulations weren't as fast as the science was working. So they were still working under the same kind of regulations they did with the lockdowns. And if you've had experience with bureaucracy, you know that it moves at a snail's pace. Well, more like a snail dipped in molasses going uphill pace. So a lot of times they were locked. We were locked out. I couldn't see her. They couldn't keep them locked in their rooms. How are you going to keep people with Alzheimer's locked in their rooms? And it was just an awful experience. She passed this year in January, very peacefully in her sleep, but it was a really hard time for both of us.
Yeah, and it's always sorry to hear someone losing somebody and going through that kind of experience.
Yeah.
Watching someone you love just decline, and it's all too common a story over the last couple
yes,
of years.
It's common, like I said, for a lot of people, but you just don't know what to do anymore.
Yeah. So now we're in 2022. So obviously you two are running for 2 statewide offices. Mary, what are your 3 core issues for this election cycle?
My 3 core issues are education, the economy, and healthcare. Education, year after year, administration after administration, focus groups, task forces, all coming to the same conclusion: more money. Throwing money at education will not improve it. Competition will. And competition through schools of choice. We need to expand that in Michigan. Unfortunately, our state has a very strict amendment in our Constitution, which does not allow any type of state or money to go to private schools, all private schools, and or to get tax breaks for private or education. But there is something out there, and I am very flattered that Betsy DeVos took an idea I had 8 years ago, and it was called an opportunity scholarship because I looked it up and other states were doing it. This is not a voucher. This is a private money into private organization, and it would provide parents who choose to leave their government school that's not working and either go into another school, another that's better, or private education, or homeschooling, or some parents are forming micropods. But it would provide them extra income to help with that. Because right now, any parent who decides to do this, to take their child out of a government school and either to private or what other types of education, are punished for it. And they shouldn't be. You should not have to pay taxes to go to the school that was failing you, and you're trying to pay for tuition or whatever to try to improve your child's education. So that's what the state legislature did put a bill on the board for this. Governor Whitmer vetoed it. But it may come up again. And if it does, and if I'm your governor, sure, I would pass it.
So you want to fund students, not systems.
Exactly. Because the system's failing. As Harry Brown said, government doesn't work. And it's done a horrible job with schools so far.
So what were those other 2 issues?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I always
we,
get into that other stuff. No, the economy.
Go. We have time here.
All right. Well, for the economy, to me, a promise made is a promise kept. As a libertarian, I believe taxation is theft. But the taxpayers of Michigan were made a promise 15 years ago to roll the income tax back to 3.9%. Need to do this. Our state brought in more revenue and spent a lot. They can afford to do this, and the taxpayers of Michigan deserve it. As I said before, they spent a lot of money.
Yeah.
And I believe they need to budget that, because this is not going to be sustainable in the future. A good rule of thumb is the growth in population plus inflation. That should be, you should not go over that. So let's say population increased by 1% and maybe inflation increased by 2%. So that's your budget right there, 3%. You don't go over that. And that would make a sustainable budget. Also, too, I despise corporate welfare. It is not fair. It's discriminatory. It's taking taxpayers' money and making winners and losers in the marketplace. And government doesn't work. And we've seen it happen. They like to toot the successes, but you never hear about the failures, and there's a lot of failures. And people in a marketplace using their money is what grows an economy, not government. Government fails. The third thing I would like to is healthcare. Right now, in Michigan, healthcare takes up 50%, almost 50% of the budget. Governor Whitmer was proud that there were 1 million people on the Michigan, on our Medicaid expansion plan, Healthy Michigan. Really. There are a lot of people on there that don't really belong on there anymore. But with the federal printing press coming into Michigan, we weren't allowed to take people off of Medicaid who may not still need to be on there. Now that's going to start to end next year, but I'm wondering, those people going back onto Healthy Michigan, what it does is people who are on Medicaid, the ones who really need it, are getting squeezed out of it. And many doctors are leaving Medicaid and Medicare just because they don't want to do all the paperwork. They became a doctor because they wanted to treat people, help people, not to fill out a bunch of forms. So they have to hire staffs, which costs more money, and it drives up the cost of their care to you. There is something that's called a direct pay program. I'm going to be using it because my doctor doesn't take new Medicare patients, and because I'm 65, I'm on Medicare. But through a direct pay or direct primary care, I pay a monthly fee. I can see him anytime I want, for as long as I want. It covers all my basic primary care, because basically that's what you get from, anyway, tests, blood draws, everything I can get for this one monthly payment, and I can save my Medicare and insurance that I get through the military for something really catastrophic. And that's the way it probably should be. But for right now in Michigan, that option is not available to Medicaid people. They would have to go out of Medicaid and do it. Now, some people have. One woman I know pays $43 a month. For some people, that may be a lot, but she feels it's worth it. She'll forego some things just so she could see her doctor when she can, instead of waiting months, and spend more time with him.
That sure beats dealing with all the bureaucrats then.
Well,
huh?
that's what drives up the cost of health care. The more rules and regulations you have, the more paperwork's involved. More paperwork means more staff. More staff means the doctor has to charge more.
Yeah.
Or the has
Much
to
more
charge
overhead.
more. Right, exactly. And that, I think, would help. Plus having more choices in how you want. If you want to pick up an e-cigarette to quit smoking, you should be able to. If you want to be able to take some homeopathic medicine, you should be able to. It would cost a lot less. Plus, you'd have a lot more choices, and I think, and that would, as I said, drive down the costs too, because too many people think that pharmaceuticals are the answer, and it may not be. There's a lot of stuff out there.
Okay, thank you, Mary.
Mm-hmm.
Greg, what are your 3 core issues?
Well, my office is a little different, and it's largely an administrative position with constitutionally defined roles. So I always tell people, if you like some of the things I talk about, please vote for Mary for governor or Libertarians for the state legislature, because they could enact those changes. But the 3 things I push for on the campaign trail are protecting voting rights, streamlining branch services, and election reform. I'll talk about voting rights first. So 4 years ago, we expanded our absentee ballot program, and we allowed for same-day voter registration. Those are things that I'd been advocating for years, and I'm very happy we have those. There are some people in the state legislature that want to try to curb those rights, so I will, if I'm in office, I will make sure I protect the voting rights of all Michigan citizens. When it comes to streamlining branch services, the lockdown showed us that a lot of government services can be streamlined or eliminated entirely. So if we can do that during the lockdown, why do we still need these things? But I want to make sure if I streamline branch services, people without access to technology are not left behind, because a lot of services require you to have some kind of computer access or phone. One thing I do want to push, and this is something the state legislature would do, is have a one-and-done vehicle registration. Right now, you have to register your car once every year or every 2 years now. We want to make it so that you register permanently, like a trailer. That way, when you buy your car, you register, you never have to go back again until the next person buys that. This would help. It would reduce the cost to own a car, especially for poor people. And getting pulled over for expired tabs is often the first step people have when entering the criminal justice system. So I don't want visiting my office to be one reason why someone gets arrested. But the big reason I'm running for Secretary of State is for election reform. Again, I can't actually change election laws, but it gives me the opportunity to discuss election reform. And being a libertarian, I'm really sympathetic to expanding the opportunity for independent and third-party candidates. Right now, the Democrats and Republicans have used the state constitution, election, and campaign finance law to create and reinforce a two-party system. So I tell voters, if you want fair and transparent elections, what better way than to pick someone from outside the two-party system? So a lot of people ask, hey, Greg, do you think the elections are rigged? And I don't necessarily think the elections are rigged, but the system definitely is. They don't need to rig the elections because the Democrats and Republicans win all the races. So 3 voting reform or election reforms I talk about are ranked choice voting for state elections. Right now, elections are decided by whoever gets the most votes, a plurality. You don't need a majority to win. If you look at the primary elections, some people would win with 20 to 30% of the vote, meaning most other voters did not want that person to be their candidate. With ranked choice voting, someone does require a majority, and the way that works is you have your first candidate and then you rank other candidates by your preference. And if no one gets majority, the last person's dropped and those votes are redistributed. This makes the person that wins an election much more representative of the voting public in that area. A bunch of other states do this, Alaska, Maine, so it is something that is starting to become more of a nationwide phenomena. Another election issue I want to push is having non-partisan local elections. Right now, county, township, and villages are required to have partisan elections. Cities don't, but counties do. Why does your township trustee have to be a Democrat or a Republican? It just ties local politics to national and international issues and reinforces the two-party system. And it's even more insidious because the winners of the primary elections for the Democrats and Republicans for these county offices become part of the county executive committee for that county, which means that the Democrats and Republicans automatically have affiliates in all 83 counties. So that's the state just subsidizing the two major parties. The last thing I want to mention, and this will be in the news fairly soon, the winner of the Democrat and Republican governor primaries are entitled under Michigan campaign finance law to $1.125 million in matching funds. I haven't seen whether or not they're collecting that this year, but that is in the law, and so I just want everyone to pay attention to that moving forward, because the other parties don't get money, but the Democrats and Republicans do get money from the state of Michigan.
So, both of you guys are running against incumbents. Greg, what do you think about your incumbent? What do you think about their performance?
I think Jocelyn Benson is a competent public servant, but I think she has done some things that have really hurt third parties in particular. This year, right now, the Bureau of Elections is not listing candidate contact information, so it's a little bit harder for media to reach everyone. But the Bureau of Elections did not publish the list of Libertarian candidates until middle of August, even though we nominated our candidates in July. The Green Party nominated theirs in April. So the four previous secretaries of state had published those, and they were all Republicans. So it looks like Jocelyn Benson is kind of using state resources to kind of push third parties away from the website, and that's I think an improper use of state funds to help the Democrats and Republicans.
Mary, what are your thoughts on the incumbent in your race, Gretchen Whitmer, and what would you have done differently over the last term?
She's a politician, and she's a good one. With the pandemic, I don't think, as if I was in her shoes, yes, we'd have a emergency, but it would be according to the other law. In other words, 28 days, and then it goes to the legislature. But as soon as we had more information, but once the information is out there for everyone, as far as mandating and locking down, no, I would ask. All right, this is what we know. This is what I want you to do. And I think a lot more would have happened if people would have been allowed voluntarily to change the way maybe they set up their restaurants or the way they did things. And I know that also, too, in June of last year, it was amazing. It was a 180 turnaround. It was like, okay, it's over now. She turned everything over to her executive branch, the Department of Health and Human Services, or moved it down in a, free fashion to let the counties and cities decide what they wanted to do. I would have done that a little sooner. I would have taken us out of lockdown a lot sooner. We didn't have to stay. And I certainly wouldn't have kept the schools closed as long as they did. But that was a lot of pressure from the teachers' unions, which are backers of her. So she's a politician, and she played it brilliantly. So now, hoping that people have short memories and are seeing things things are slightly getting back to normal now, that she can move away from what she did to this state and then start doing and start, pushing her accomplishments instead of having people remember what happened a couple of years ago. And I kind of see that with people that I've been talking to. Another thing, too, though, is that on the books, there are still like 30 emergency powers that she can use. And those things need to have, and hopefully if I'm elected and I get some help with libertarians in the state legislatures to put some guardrails around this. Because a governor shouldn't have this much power. And also, too, she can take that, she can use or push I don't want to say push it, but give it to her executive branch officers who have the same punishing capability that she does.
Yeah.
And that's really scary. The Department of Health and Human Services can call a medical or a health emergency, but there's really nothing to define what a health emergency is. So, yeah, maybe more lockdowns, I certainly hope not. But no, we have to look at those things and get some guardrails around it.
Yes, and for all the boo-ah-hing the Republicans did when Gretchen Whitmer was exercising all of this authority, that as soon as she just delegated that authority to her Department of Health and Human Services, they all of a sudden just went quiet.
Yeah.
You know, what did they do to help people? Which is why it's important to elect libertarians.
They still kept things locked down. Like I said, the office, OSHA and Department of Health and Human Services kept me away from my mother longer than it should have been. And also, too, she has an authority. Everybody's talking about, road construction. She wanted to fix the damn roads. Well, boy, howdy, are they getting fixed now? But what happened was she jump-started that, because even with all the federal printed money that was coming in, plus the budget, and we had Michigan made quite a bit of money last year. She had to jumpstart it, so what she decides to do is take out a $3.5 billion bond, which Michigan Department of Transportation took $800 million of to help jumpstart all the road construction. Gee, just right before an election.
Wow.
Brilliant. The woman is brilliant.
So, Greg, we know very well that the 2020 election steal is still a high priority for a lot of voters. Obviously, you don't have to agree with that. But how would you address concerns of election security to one of those people?
I just tell them I'm not a Democrat or a Republican, so I think having someone from completely outside the two-party system might give some people more confidence that the elections are fair. I also advocate for having paper ballots for all elections, no touchscreen, so that there can be a physical recount on actual ballots if necessary. But I just, I agree with people that think the system is rigged. Once I pivot to that, most people do agree. Most people think we need multiple parties in office, and with someone like me running the elections, I think a lot of people will feel more confident that they're run more fairly.
Okay. So, Mary, race, policing, and criminal justice became huge issues for the 2020 election following the slaying of George Floyd. But nothing has changed in the criminal justice system since then. Just this year, a man in Grand Rapids, Patrick Loyola, was brutally killed by police, yet got weirdly little coverage by the media. What happened? What changed in this country for such dramatically different coverage? And what would your policies on criminal justice reform be? First,
what's happened is we're going into an election, and everybody wants to look like the law and order executive. Tudor Dixon posing with police on the stairs of the courthouse in Grand Rapids, Gretchen Whitmer with state police and her plans on crime and crime prevention. I hate to say it, but they're really political stunts, because just a few months before we saw Governor Whitmer marching with the Black Lives Matter group, without a mask on, by the way. And so, but now she's, all for, getting our streets safe and supporting the police and more money for the police, etc. For me, number one is to hold the police accountable. They weren't even talking about that, Dixon or Whitmer, holding police accountable for when they do step over the line, when they do criminal acts. And another second thing would be everybody, defund the police. No, defund the police unions, because every city needs to start looking at their collective bargaining agreements, because those collective bargaining agreements keep bad cops on the street, because cities can't always pay when they want more pay and benefits, so they go to another tact. And one of those is to keep the records sealed, and it does, and many times keeps bad cops on the streets. And I say this, and it doesn't always get a whole lot of enthusiasm, but you want to start keeping neighborhoods safe, certain neighborhoods, and the war on drugs. Police, when they enter a neighborhood, everybody wants to know, why are they here, and are they going to be busting me because I'm possessing something? And a lot of times they do. Pulling people over for routine traffic stops, and they're looking for drugs. End the war on drugs. It would keep police safe. It would keep people safe, keep neighborhoods safe. And also, too, there are groups, civic groups, and that are supported by private money charities. They need to be allowed to keep working, because they are doing a lot in the neighborhoods to keep kids from joining gangs, because that would be a big thing with ending the drug war. Defund the gangs. So those are the things I would try to emphasize.
Sure. So, last question for you guys is, every single household in the state is suffering the effects of inflation and an economy that we all know is in a recession. What are you going to do to help Michigan families and workers overcome this?
As I said before, a promise made is a promise kept. Lower that income tax rate back down to 3.9%, like you said you were going to. And with more revenue, et cetera, there may be a possibility you can get it down to even farther than that. And that would free up some money for people. Gretchen Whitmer wants to give everybody $500. Big deal. A tax cut would be for a long term. She's just thinking short term. I think that's why I like being a libertarian so much, is because we think out long term, not just what's going to happen in 2 years or 4 years when I have to run for re-election again. So that would help families out too, tremendously. And I don't know if this, I know I wouldn't do it if I was governor, but damn, taking all the federal printed money, and then she says, oh, I don't have anything to do with inflation. Duh, really? But I guess all other states are doing it, and so I've got to, get my share too. But, my mom had a saying about that. It was something about a bridge. But anyway, that's what I would do.
So, Greg, Secretary of State is not often thought about as something that has an impact on the kitchen table issues, but what would you do to help families?
Well, I'd mentioned earlier, I'd like to try to streamline services if possible. Anytime that any people have to come in less frequently to the branch office, that'll save them time and money. I'd earlier mentioned, extending the vehicle registration to a permanent situation. 4 years ago, I advocated for reforms to no-fault auto insurance, and that's been done. But I think that anytime we can reduce the amount of time you're seeing the Secretary of State, or the cost of seeing a Secretary of State, is something I'll advocate for and work with the legislature and governor to enact those changes.
So that covers the last of our questions. Why don't we take some time to say your name, say what office you're running for, and tell me, how do we keep in contact with you?
Well, thank you, Connor. Once again, my name is Greg Stempfle, Libertarian for Secretary of State. You can find my website at www.stempfle4sos.org. I'm also on social media at Stempfle4SOS on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram.
My name is Mary Buzuma, and I'm running for governor. You can find more information on me on my website is electmarybuzuma.com. I'm also on Twitter, LPMaryForGov, and Facebook, LPMaryForGov.
So that concludes our Libertarian Party of Michigan election special for today. We hope you have been introduced to two candidates that you can be proud of. So have a great day and take care.